First up is Katie Gordon.
All right.
You're up whenever you want to go.
All right. Hi, everyone. Like you said, my name is Katie Lawton, and today I'll be talking to you about wildlife trafficking of pangolins. Rotate this.
Just, yeah. Yes. That's -5. No, it's not. It's weird. You've got to just click on that screen quickly and you should be under. Okay, you're under.
There we go. Okay, so this is a pangolin. A lot of people have never heard of them, but they are the world's most trafficked animal. They make up 20% of all trafficked animals, and this amounts to 100,000 pangolins trafficked every year. Why should we conserve pangolins? So this photo here shows the 8 species of pangolin. 4 of them live in Africa and 4 in Asia, as you can see. All 8 species of pangolins are threatened with extinction, and all 8 are decreasing in number. This means that they're in a very real threat of going extinct in the near future. Pangolins are very important, and stopping their trafficking is very important because, for one, it poses a threat to humans with disease transmission in wildlife trafficking markets. And second, it has important ecological impacts on their ecosystem when pangolins are removed from it. So first, I want to talk about the threat to humans through zoonotic diseases. As you can see here from this graphic from the CDC, zoonotic diseases are those that are spread between animals and people. Wildlife trafficking markets in general pose a huge risk to humans of spreading these diseases because of the close contact between the animals and humans, and could have a jump of an animal disease to a human. This is what we saw with COVID-19, and actually pangolins were thought for a while to be a vector of COVID-19 because there's a similar coronavirus that's circulated in the pangolin community. However, when they looked more at the genome of the different coronaviruses, they found that it was only 92% or similar. So pangolins were not thought to be the vector. However, it still poses a real threat in the future to prevent future pandemics like this one, to limit the amount of contact between humans and animals in wildlife trafficking markets. Next, I'll talk about the ecological importance of pangolins. Here are some of their ecosystem services and photos of them doing it. First, insect consumption. Pangolins eat ants and termites mainly, and it was shown that pangolins can eat an average of 70 million ants or termites every year. This amounts to billions within a whole ecosystem of pangolins, and that's very important pest control that they provide for their ecosystems. This saves humans billions of dollars every year in pest control around the world, in Africa and Asia where these guys live. Taking that away would cause a huge influx of insect populations and have a lot of damage to the animal ecosystem as well as the human communities that live there. Next, soil health. So penguins use their long claws to dig through the soil and look for insects, and also to burrow into tunnels. This digging turns over the soil and is good for the aeration of the soil, provides good nutrient cycling, and overall helps with decomposition and increased productivity of the vegetation. So by increasing the productivity of the vegetation, it provides important roles for a lot of the other animals in that ecosystem to thrive on. Lastly, burrowing tunnels. They burrow tunnels, as you can see in this photo, to walk through and live in. And once they vacate those tunnels and don't live there anymore, other animals in the ecosystem can use them to live in and hide in and transport themselves through. So there are a wide variety of reasons why penguins are endangered, and it's a very complex problem. Although the international trade of penguins was banned in 2017, there's still a very prevalent illegal trade, as shown in this photo here. So all of these lines show international trade routes of pangolins. Most of them are exported out of Africa, sometimes through Europe as a stopping point, and then mostly to Asia and the United States. There's also a lot of domestic trade happening within Asian countries, from Southeast Asia and India to other countries in Asia, such as China and Vietnam. The orange routes signify routes that have been used for 5 or more consecutive years. So those are the main routes. The reasons for this trafficking are their scales are used in traditional Chinese medicine. Their scales are made up of a protein called keratin. It's the same stuff that makes up your fingernails, and it has no proven medicinal value. However, in traditional Chinese medicine, it's used for a variety of practices, such as stimulating lactation, curing cancer, and curing asthma. Pangolin scales are rumored to do all of those things, but there is no scientific proof that any of that happens. So it's important to educate those communities and raise awareness. Also, pangolin meat is considered a delicacy in many countries in Africa and Asia, and eaten by a lot of the local communities and foreign communities. So that's another big reason why they're trafficked. And lastly, habitat loss and degradation. This comes in the form of human population growth expanding into the pangolin environments and deforestation of their habitats. This graphic shows international trafficking of pangolins and some statistics surrounding that. As you can see, they've broken it up between body parts, whole pangolins, and scales. But overall, there were 120 tons of pangolin parts confiscated in that 5-year period, and that's only those that were seized from the international routes. So it's estimated that the actual value of pangolins that are being trafficked that were not seized is way, way higher. And it's impossible to know how many are being sold. So as you can see, the scales make up the largest proportion of the amount that's trafficked, followed by whole pangolins and then their body parts. Down here at the bottom, I think it's worth noting that there are 159 international trade routes. So the ones that I showed in the previous slide are not even a fraction of them. And also an average of 27 new unique routes emerge each year, which is significant because it shows that these routes are ever changing to try and keep it under the radar. And so it's very hard to police wildlife trafficking. So in conclusion, to protect these pangolins, there are a variety of fronts that they need to be protected on. The first one is legislation and enforcement. This looks like passing more strict regulations and rules in the countries where pangolins are being killed and those where they're being bought and sold and trafficked through. So an increasing enforcement in those areas. Second, demand reduction and awareness. So the killing will only continue as long as there's a demand for pangolin scales and meat. And so by reducing that demand, you will reduce the supply of the poachers killing them and transporting them. So raising awareness in the local communities that buy and sell these pangolins is very important, letting them know that they're in danger, they're at risk of extinction, and that their scales do not provide any sort of medicinal value. So working with and educating communities in that way. And lastly, conservation research is very important with any species of interest. Pangolins are solitary and very elusive, and so they're kind of difficult to track in the wild, but increasing these monitoring efforts and reporting efforts will give us a better idea of how the pangolins are doing, how their numbers and trends are showing in their populations, and how we can better conserve them. These are some of my references. Thank you all for listening, and I will take any questions that you have now.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I want, again, I know this is a little rushed. We've got such a big class, and so we won't take questions or things like that, but yeah. I need to grab an extra couple of the evaluation forms. Just make sure you have 5. If you have more than 5 minutes, grab a couple because I'm short. Are there any extras that are not?
You have the last pile. I don't know if you have 5.
But any extras beyond 5, I'll be more than that with 10, 5. No, everybody? Okay, no worries. Just didn't print it out. Okay, that was 7 minutes and 30 seconds. So that's great. And again, there's no, no penalty for short. It would be for long if you go over in a conference presentation of any short. Okay, next up is, I have Grace next.
That's mine.
Next one. I have Grace next. Just go in order of whatever the email. There we go. Excellent. All right, let's do this. Let's share screen. Just Zoom is being prepared. Sure. Just 1 sec, and then I will say. Okay, whenever you're ready, please.
The United States loses an estimated $82 million a year in the seafood and tourism industry due to this expansive hypoxic zone located in the Gulf Coast. So today I will be discussing some of the causes of this hypoxic zone, as well as the potential impacts and some solutions that are being used to help mitigate the problem. This is the Mississippi watershed. It's the third largest drainage basin in the world, covering approximately 1,245,000 square meters. It drains over 40% of the continental US. I included this graph because I think it's important to realize just how widespread the drainage basin really is. The river itself has both economic and ecological importance. It's a crucial economic hub. It supports over 1.5 million jobs. It produces about $10 billion annually in terms of revenue for fishing and hunting. It's also a huge ecological habitat. It provides critical breeding grounds for 40% of the nation's waterfowl. The river alone supports about 25% of all North American species, including roughly 50 mammals and 145 amphibians and reptiles. But there's a problem going on. So what's happening? There's a large, expansive hypoxic zone located along the Texas-Louisiana border. I think it's important to define what hypoxia is, and usually in the case of the Gulf Coast hypoxic zone, it's typically defined as anywhere below 2 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen, but really anything under 4 milligrams is considered a level of concern. This is typically because fish can't survive past about 4 milligrams per liter. So how does hypoxia occur? Typically, it starts with excess nutrients, which in the case of the Gulf Coast, the limiting nutrient we've seen is nitrogen. The nitrogen enters the system through runoff, which causes algal blooms. Those algae typically die off, and then the microbes increase and decrease the available oxygen. This causes rapid oxygen depletion, which leads to sudden fish kills and no life in the aquatic zone. This map is showing the 1985 hypoxic map. This was really the first documented and continuous study of the hypoxic zone. And at this time, it was 3,700 square miles. And then if you look in 2002, you can see that this more than doubles. This was the second largest recorded zone. It was approximately 8,500 square miles. There was a larger zone documented in 2017, and that was nearly 9,000 square miles. So as you can see from these two depictions, it's not just accounted for by seasonal variations or even small annual increases. It's definitely human caused, or at least worsened by human practices. So the current hypoxic conditions in 2020, the map was measured to be approximately 2,116 square miles. This was the third smallest recorded zone since 1985. That's not very reflective of the actual problem. This is because Hurricane Hanna came in and caused extensive mixing, which really served to decrease the size of the zone. But scientists believe that the actual zone is likely 3 to 4 times larger than what was recorded. So yes, the 5-year average is now down to 5,408 square miles. But as I said, this isn't necessarily reflective of the problem that's actually going on. So it's still a large concern. So first we need to look at what are the sources of excess nutrients. Primarily, it's agricultural runoff. The Mississippi River receives 10,000 pounds per year of nitrogen fertilizer, which is a significant increase since pre-industrial times, approximately 4-fold. And then in tandem with nitrogen fertilizer use, we also have a lot of conversion of woodland to upstream woodlands to farmland. This was a 80% decrease in forested areas. That's typically being used for the timber, or in this case, converted farmland. Historic conditions have been about 9.7 million hectares of bottomland hardwood forest, which is now down to only 2.1 million. There's also an urban and industrial component to this. It's not just agriculture, although that is largely the primary concern. So first, we need to understand that the river itself is heavily engineered. There's thousands of dams and levees, channelization, and dredging activity. They're all causing problems with slow or even stagnant water. And this is dangerous because stagnant water is especially vulnerable to hypoxic conditions. We also have nutrient loads coming from wastewater effluent. The Mississippi River receives treated and raw sewage from 31 states. And then another significant source of nutrient load is urban and storm drains. Urban runoffs and centers collects into storm drains, which is not treated and goes directly into water bodies. A study by Duke University actually saw that urban streams were seeing conditions of hypoxia, so it's not just a problem at the Gulf Coast. So what are some of the impacts of hypoxia? As I said, there's no ecological and economic benefits, so there's also ecological and economic impacts. First, you have large fish kills, which are affected not just in the zone itself, but thousands of miles outside of it. Affects spawning and migration patterns, as well as food web interactions. And then economically, you have a huge decrease in marine productivity. Fishermen are having to travel further out and are catching less fish, which is lowering, this is called catch per unit of energy, which makes the overall operations of fishing industry less economically viable. And there's also a component of greenhouse gas emissions. We're seeing that there's an observed increase in methane and nitrous oxide emission in hypoxic conditions. And so what are some potential mitigation strategies to try to thwart the situation? I've outlined kind of a few. So first, it involves reconnecting rivers to their floodplains, restoring upland woodland and coastal wetlands, working directly with farmers to reduce fertilizer use, and then promoting legislation to try to further limit the excess nutrients. So in reconnecting rivers to their floodplains, this is typically achieved by lowering the levees, or in some cases removing them, particularly in selected non-urban environments. And then it also involves preserving the connections that we do have. So this is the New Madrid floodway, which is a vital connection. It's the last connection to the Missouri backwaters. So we need to make sure that we're maintaining the connections that we still do have. In reconnecting rivers to their floodplains, this would provide natural processes of filtration to try to reduce nutrient load. And it would also provide flood control. As you can see in this area, flooding is a pretty significant problem. In 2011, Mississippi flooding cost an estimated $2.8 billion in damages. And this picture is showing you that floodwaters inundated residential areas all the way up to Tennessee. Next is restoring native upstream habitats. So bringing back the woodlands that have been converted to farmland. We need to bring back woodlands on 4 million acres of farmland. It also involves restoring the coastal wetlands that we have. Over 80% of the upper Mississippi native wetlands have been lost. So we need to restore the coastal wetlands by allowing water to slide into channels. This would create new habitat for fish. Also, we need to use existing locks and dams to try to lower the water levels and expose mudflats for shorebirds, creating more habitat. And then lastly, increasing green infrastructure in surrounding urban areas. So if you can recall back to the urban component, this would serve to decrease the urban nutrient load. And then next is working directly with farmers. We need to first primarily reduce the reliance of nitrogen fertilizer and also incentivize planting cover crops. We've actually seen significant strides in this. There was an increase from 1.9 million hectares of cover crops to 4.2 million acres over the last 2 decades. We also need to protect our prairie potholes and plant more grass filter strips to try to control the runoff that is coming in. And then strongly consider shifting away from reliance on corn crops to maybe considering more water intensive crops like alfalfa in regions where runoff rates are extremely high. So this graph is showing a 5-year range. And as you can see, there's significant increase in the amount of cover crops being planted. And then lastly, we need to promote legislation. The Restore Act kind of serves as a trust fund. It's similar to the CERCLA Act, the Superfund sites. It serves as a trust fund for coastal restoration plans. And then the Farm Bill, which provides concrete financial and technical assistance for farmers that are trying to implement more conservative practices like best management strategies. So why is this important? Well, there's a huge economic and social component of this. So gaining 10% wetland cover can decrease total volume of floods by 70%, which would mean that every dollar we invest into flood control through wetland restoration will result in $5 of savings. Over 30 million people live and work in the basin and rely on it directly for food and water and transportation. So it's something that we strongly need to push for active conservation.
Super, thank you, Grace. That was 10 minutes and 15 seconds. That was excellent.
I'm gonna put it on the hard drive.
Okay.
It wouldn't pop up on my. When I plugged it in.
Wouldn't?
No,
Okay, you just want to go with what you have and,
sure. I can just talk about the slides that I have.
yeah, no, that's absolutely fine.
Okay.
That is fine. Sorry, this is just such a gigantic workflow.
There you go.
Thank you. All right, you are up.
Okay, so I added slides right before class that aren't gonna be on here. So I'm gonna have my computer on here and try to tell you about what the slides are that I added. So firstly, my title slide, I'll be discussing the potentials of urban and suburban soils as a carbon sink and the implications of the storage potential as a sort of weapon against climate change. Maybe,
Not doing it,
no.
pushing that right arrow.
It's on this.
Right now.
Or
That's
just
it.
use that.
No, go back. That's just not working right. That's epic. Okay, yeah,
I can use the
well,
keyboard.
just use the keyboard.
Okay,
Yeah, improvise.
perfect. Okay, so first I would like to briefly go over some foundational knowledge. So most of you, since we're all in class together, probably know that this is the carbon cycle. And the image on the screen just illustrates the different mediums through which carbon is transported and stored throughout the different spheres of the earth. And to go over just one specific example that, again, we all probably know, photosynthesis. So that is, of course, when plants take in carbon dioxide and consume and fixate carbon dioxide into oxygen. And then, so the reason carbon storage is so important is because it is a greenhouse gas, meaning it absorbs and radiates heat. And the release or radiation of that heat happens gradually over time. So although carbon exists in the atmosphere naturally, the increasing anthropogenic sources are making the rate of carbon increase. So to elaborate, so this is one of the slides that is on my computer and not on here. You can't really see it, but it's a graph showing carbon emissions pre-industrial through the Industrial Revolution to 2021. And the two most important statistics that I have on this slide are 280 ppm. That is the level of carbon in the atmosphere pre-industrial. And then the Industrial Revolution occurred, which began about 1750 and ended around 1840. And according to Rebecca Lindsay's article published through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, after the Industrial Revolution, carbon emissions began to increase to about 5 billion tons per year, and then 35 billion tons per year by the end of the 20th century. So in 2019, atmospheric carbon reached 409.8 ppm. And the graph that I have on the slide is literally exponential, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So I would also like to point out that according to the same article that I just mentioned, the paleoclimatic evidence, so air bubbles and ice and glacial evidence, shows that before the Industrial Revolution, atmospheric carbon never exceeded 300 ppm, and 2 years ago, it was barely above 400. Oh, excuse me for the moment. Okay, so soil and carbon storage. There is an article published by the New York Times that stated ever since the Industrial Revolution with soil disturbances, and soil disturbances are agriculture, urbanization, suburbanization, any type of activity that disturbs soil in its original form, 50 to 70% loss of original carbon storage has been experienced. And that's because when you disturb the soil, the CO2 that's stored, or the carbon that's stored, meets oxygen from the atmosphere, and it becomes CO2 and it's released into the atmosphere. So specifically, what I'd like to talk about now is urbanization as one of the main disturbances and the effects of urbanization on carbon storage in the atmosphere. So according to Eigenbrod and Davies, there's a quote that I added on this slide on my computer. Alteration in land use will be a major driver of changes in the distribution of ecosystem services before 2050. So all of this article specifically, alteration was urbanization, and it discussed how urbanization is the key driver of this dramatic change. And this is largely due to population growth and the percentage of population choosing to live in urban areas. And specifically in 2020, 56.2% of the population lived in urban areas. Okay, now I'm going to discuss return to normal levels and normal levels of carbon sequestration in soil. So when you are undergoing urbanization, you're removing the O horizon and the A horizon. And the A horizon is also known as topsoil, but those layers are where the organic matter and nutrients are, and that's where the sequestration potentials are as well. So if you have untouched land, you're taking those horizons away and you're removing the potential of the soil to store carbon. And you're putting concrete down and foundations for homes, and you're taking away all the organic matter, so it's not storing any more carbon. But if you're picturing it in your head right now, you have a neighborhood, and the people that move into those homes plant trees and plant vegetation and landscaping in their front yard. So eventually the organic matter that falls from those plants falls back onto the soil as organic matter, and eventually over time accumulates and restabilizes the soil and reinforces its ability to store carbon. So untouched land, if you were looking at a neighborhood or a development area, a park would be practically untouched. It would have the most sequestration potential. And then a house that was built 30 years ago would likely have more carbon sequestration potential than a younger house because it's been there for longer. So the organic matter has had time to accumulate and the soil has had time to regain potential to store carbon. But then a house that was built 10 years ago has more potential than a house that was built last year. So there have been multiple researches done that are in my references at the end of this slide that show as houses and urbanization areas age, that their ability to store carbon increases as well. So my question is suburbanization, does it have the same rate of retention as urbanization? And my guess is that it would be quicker, because if you're looking at a suburb versus New York City or Manhattan or a big city like that, then there's more space and there's more grass exposed and people plant more trees than there are in the city. So my guess is that suburbanization rates of carbon potential would be quicker than urbanization. And then image links, and then my references slide is on my computer, but not on here.
Okay, great. 7 minutes and 30, so you're right in the Katie Lawton range there, which is good. Sorry about not getting the slides up.
No, that's okay.
Good. Next up, I think it's time to hear about carbon. Such a sleepy computer this morning. Jess, you can just use the arrows on the. Pointers down. Yeah, I think the pointers, you just go left and right on the keyboard. Thanks, Jesse.
Maybe it would have been a good idea if we had this discussion over a cup of coffee,
Think so?
but then we shall just proceed nonetheless with the true imagination of having it. So today I want to discuss the potential solutions that we can make to the environmental problems we have using cheap organic waste that we generate from our homes in our everyday lives. And as an example, we have the molded coffee. So like Madeline said, the carbon cycle is really an important contributing factor to the geochemical processes that happen on the earth and the different layers of the earth atmosphere, the soil and the water systems. And the major processes that add the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is respiration. And as you can tell from the equation, we are simply reacting organic matter with oxygen, which is combustion, to release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Photosynthesis is just the opposite of respiration. By simply combining carbon dioxide with water, you are then creating the organic matter that is fixated into the soil and into the plant systems. And in that way, you have two different systems that are controlling the exchange of carbon in the earth systems. But my major focus usually is the composition, which really is not anything separate from respiration, simply because we have microorganisms that are digesting different organic matter and thus releasing carbon dioxide and water to the atmosphere. So a little bit about microorganisms. So like Martin said, soil is one of the biggest terrestrial reservoirs of carbon that we have on the earth, besides the oceans and the water system. But the potential for soil to keep carbon and other nutrients and other chemical components together all happens as a result of different systems and processes that are happening within. And an example of those processes are the microorganisms, such as the bacteria, the fungi, and the yeast, and something like that, that help to convert organic molecules into simple carbon dioxide molecules as well. So the biggest problem that we have right now, well, one of the biggest problems is climate change. And based on the research and the studies, we realized that carbon is one of the biggest, or the most potent greenhouse gases that we have. And it all comes from the carbon cycle, as we see. So it makes more sense that the microorganisms that are acting in these soils are contributing to the carbon dioxide gas levels in the atmosphere, and hence the greenhouse effect that is later connected to the global warming. So if you have ever seen any activity of fungi on anything, one example could be the white rot growing on something or like on a plant matter that's been left for a very long time to decay. So that is how they usually respire, by feeding on dead decaying organic matter. And they release enzymes to chew on these complex surface materials of organic matter so that they can be able to eat them much easier. But as a process, these microbes release waste and gases and other things, including carbon dioxide, to the atmosphere. So in a nutshell, the microorganisms are very partial and important to the carbon cycle, which contributes to climate change. Another problem that we face in the environment is the pollution. And most interestingly is that it also works in cycles. The only problem with pollution that we really have is that we are producing more pollutants than we have the mechanisms to remove them from the environment. And that's what creates all the different pollutions we have either on land, in water, or in other places, including the Mississippi River that we just saw earlier. So my research is basically focused on how can we solve these big problems: climate change and pollution using the cheapest methods possible, because we need to get results as fast as possible without having to endure so much economic losses. So I let coffee grounds. We collected wasted coffee grounds and we let them to mold for 7 months in different time segments. So 0 month means that the coffee ground was not molded. It was purely just wasted coffee ground. Then 3, 4, 5 months, all the way to 7 months were all molded. In other words, we let the fungi to act on our coffee grounds. And then we performed 2 main experiments. So the first one was the material characterization. We just wanted to know, what does the fungi do to the physical properties of these coffee grounds? If anything, could it be useful in determining the solution to the 2 main problems that we're trying to address: climate change and pollution? So the results from the material characterization mainly included the TGA analysis. So TGA is the thermogravimetric analysis, which simply shows the stability of a material to degrade. So we wanted to see, how does the fungi affect the coffee ground susceptibility to degradation in the environment? So we tried to recreate the same atmospheres in a lab by giving the coffee grounds carbon and nitrogen, which are like the most abundant elements in the environment, and try to see, as a function of time, as it is molding from 0, 3 to 4, all the way to 7 months, are we having any increase in the stability, or are we decreasing the stability of the coffee grounds to degradation? So the results from the TGA show that the fungi prefer to chew more on nitrogen than carbon. As you can see, the differences in the ratios, all the way from 0 to 7 months, the proportion of carbon is way higher than the one of nitrogen. What does that really mean? Is that the fungi is feeding on the functional groups that have nitrogen in these coffee grounds. Why? Because fungi need nitrogen in their own systems, the same way we eat food to live and to grow and survive. It doesn't mean that the fungi is not chewing on the carbon, but it just means it's much more preferred to eat the nitrogen faster for it to have enough energy to continue thriving through. Another analysis that we performed is the nuclear magnetic resonance analysis, which simply shows, in simple terms, the functional groups that are in these coffee grounds. So as we know, different organic compounds have like maybe carboxylic acids, alcohols, name them. So we wanted to see, what are the most dominant functional groups that are being left behind when the fungi chews on these coffee grounds. Too bad I can't point on the screen, but then from the results that we see, as a factor of molding time from 0 to 3 all the way to 7 months, we see that the methyl groups, if you can look at the peak, it's much higher at 0 months, which means before molding, we have a lot of CH groups, methyl groups, but as you start molding all the way down, the peak lowers down. What does that mean? Is that the fungi is actually consuming more of the methyl groups, more than the CO groups, which have a higher peak than the CH groups. And the CO groups really represent carboxylic function groups. What does that mean? It means that the fungi prefers to eat something that is easier to eat within a limited short of time and takes less energy, which are the methyl groups. But it is leaving behind the carboxylic function groups because they are more stable. They have more strong bonds that resist degradation in the environment. So after the analysis of what physical properties are really the fungi is changing on the coffee mold, we decided to see, could these changes really influence how much of pollutants are removed from the environment if we wanted to use coffee waste as a resource to pollutant solutions. So we used ginger and violet. How many people know ginger and violet? Okay, wonderful. So it's purple and it's a dye. So it's basically a dye that's used in clothes to change different colors. So we used it as an example or as a model for an environmental pollutant in nature. Then we wanted to see how much of our coffee grounds are able to remove this ginger and violet as a function of molding time. So the experiment is still ongoing, and that's why I have not attached the results yet. But by the next presentation, we shall have come up with the best way to represent the removal efficiency of the ginger and violet as a factor of molding time. So for the future studies, once I'm done with this one, I'm trying to see how fast is the ginger and violet being removed by my coffee farms? Because if you want to take this, the industry sector, each want to put your money on it, you want to know how fast can I get this done with? So that then we can say, okay, good, we have solved one of the biggest problems in nature using what nature provides itself, coffee waste. And then we also want to see, could there be a solution also to the carbon cycle problem, the climate change? Because like I said earlier, it's all about cycles. If you're producing more than you're removing, then we start to have an imbalance and that creates a problem. So in the future, we want to see, could there be a potential for my coffee mold to also hold together different carbon layers and forms in the ground? And that's it for now.
Great, thanks, Jesse. 10 minutes and 6 seconds, so you're also.
I wasn't breathing.
Oh, good. All right, and then Lauren, do you have class after this? Okay. If you have class and you're feeling stressed and you need to go, please do. If you do need to go, then just gather up your stuff and leave it on the front here and I'll pick it up afterwards. But let's see if we can put Lauren on the spot here quickly. Beginning to think that 10 people in this class is probably a little too many. Let's see if this is going to- Okay. Lauren, you're up.
So hi, if y'all don't know, my name is Lauren Griffin, and today I'm going to be talking to y'all about the ocean and single-use plastics. So the first thing I kind of wanted to show y'all was to give y'all some perspective on how much plastic there really is. So this statistic is based on 2018, so obviously in 2021, there's going to be a little bit more plastic than in this, but there's about 8.3 billion tons of plastic on the earth right now, which for perspective is equivalent to 25,000 Empire State Buildings or 1 billion elephants, which is a ton. And this is not including, or this is just all plastic, not just single-use plastic, but we'll talk about single-use plastic in just a little bit. So what is a single-use plastic? This is kind of a redundant definition, but a single-use plastic is basically plastic that's used once and then discarded. So for example, the plastic utensils that they give you at restaurants for takeout, takeout containers, to-go cups, water, like plastic water bottles, or grocery bags. There's a lot of other examples too, like candy wrappers or plastic straws or Ziploc bags. So there really is a ton of plastic, single-use plastic out there that we use without even knowing it. And so how abundant are single-use plastics? Over 40% of the plastic produced last year was used just once and then discarded. So that's almost half of the plastic on this planet is used just once and then thrown away, which, don't get me wrong, plastic is an incredible invention, but if we're wasting almost half of it by just using it once, there's a big issue there. So the distribution of single-use plastic production by region is shown on this graph. So you can see that Northeast Asia is the prime producer of single-use plastics, closely followed by North America, and then the Middle East closely followed by Europe. So it's not just an American problem, and it's also not just an Asian problem. It is a global problem that can't just be fixed by one country or another implementing their own strategies. So doesn't recycling help? I think that's a question that we all need to ask ourselves. Well, everyone recycles, right? So the problem shouldn't be as bad as it is. But in reality, only about 9% of plastics get recycled, which leaves the remaining 91% to either be incinerated, stored in landfills, or dumped into water bodies such as rivers and oceans, as seen in this picture. The reason why recycling doesn't work as well as we would all hope is because the first reason is that most people recycle wrong. So there's a lot of things out there that you think can be recycled or you think shouldn't be recycled, so you put it into your recycling bin, and then once it gets to the landfill recycling plants, there's so much in your trash bags that can't actually be recycled. And so instead of having people just sit there and sort through your trash as their job, they end up just throwing the entire thing into landfills, which is a really big issue. And then the second reason is that waste facilities don't want to spend a fortune sorting through your trash that you didn't recycled properly. So we just don't have enough time and enough resources to have people sift through individually packed items of trash. And so that's another reason. And so absolutely, I think we should all continue to recycle, but in reality, it's not doing much and it's not doing as much as it should be. So where does plastic waste end up? So in this graph here, the 9% that I just talked about gets recycled. Another percentage gets incinerated, which in and of itself is harmful to the environment because it can produce harmful emissions and stuff like that. And then they either get landfilled, dumped, or sadly littered into the environment. And so the part that gets littered in the environment is what I'm going to talk to you all about today. So there are three main issues about plastic or single-use plastic in the environment that I'm going to talk to you all about, and that is how it affects wildlife, how it affects people, and how it affects aesthetics. So the first one that I'm going to talk to you all about is how plastics in the ocean affect wildlife. So over 800 species worldwide are affected by marine debris, 80% of which is plastic. So that includes fish, seabirds, sea turtles, marine mammals, and all those things. They either become entangled in, like in this picture, or they ingest it, meaning that they either breathe it in or they eat it, causing suffocation, starvation, and drowning, which is really, really sad, which affects, as I said, over 800 species. So it's really prevalent. And the second thing that I said I was going to talk about was aesthetics, and this is probably the least important issue about single-use plastics, but I did think it was notable. So as you can tell in these pictures, the litter will also affect tourism and just the way, like honestly, like physical safety of beaches. So no one's going to want to take their kids to this beach, right, where you can easily step on something or have your kids like put that stuff in their mouths. So that can easily affect tourism and also just the overall aesthetic. You're not going to want to like vacation on this beach because it's like ugly. And the third one that I wanted to talk about was how oceans affect humans. Well, the big chunks of plastic don't necessarily affect humans as much. Humans are really, really affected by microplastics, which is shown in this metaphorical picture. And so microplastics are shown in that picture right there. They don't always look like that. Sometimes they can be microscopic, but plastic doesn't really degrade. It doesn't decompose. It takes about 450 to 500 years for a piece of plastic to actually degrade in the ocean. And so like through weathering and erosion and stuff like that, big pieces of plastic will end up turning into these little tiny fragments of plastic. And that could be remains of clothing, fishing gear, paint dust, bottles, synthetic fibers, all that kind of stuff that can turn into these little tiny microscopic particles. And so humans ingest microplastic through bioaccumulation, which we've talked about in a lot of our classes here, but I'll reiterate. So if you have plastic floating up at the top right here, these little microscopic or like planktonic organisms will eat it, and these little dots inside represent like the accumulation of plastic in their body or microplastic in their bodies. And it'll bioaccumulate up the food chain until we eat the bigger fish, and then our accumulation of microplastics is significantly higher than where it first started. And that is how it can begin to be dangerous. So the average person's microplastic consumption is between 70,000 and 121,000 particles per year, which is a ton. And since plastic is hydrophobic, meaning that water will stick to it, it's absorbent. Other harmful substances can be absorbed by it, such as DDT or hydrocarbons. So even if microplastics in and of itself aren't super dangerous to us, they can absorb things that are harmful, and then we can eat those through bioaccumulation and then have issues there. So some health risks include organ damage, cancers, and lung damage. So, and also, as I stated here, further studies are needed. There's not a whole lot of studies out there stating solid fact on how microplastics can actually affect the health of people. We know 100% sure that they're bad for you. We just don't know to what extent yet. But the most dangerous form of microplastics is airborne microplastics, which is very common. And those have been proven to affect your lungs and respiratory issues, causing cancers and stuff like that. And so the next thing that I wanted to talk about is garbage patches, which goes along with affecting wildlife and people and aesthetics. So a garbage patch looks like this. It's basically just a giant accumulation of floating plastic that can accumulate in one of these 5 areas that I have shown here. Those are the 5 biggest garbage patches that we have in the world. So when people litter their trash, or the wind will take their trash that's been littered on the ground to water bodies, they will enter the oceans through rivers. As y'all know, like most rivers lead to the ocean, and so all that trash will go through the rivers into the ocean. And since plastic is buoyant, most of it floats. So that means this floating trash will be swept by ocean currents and carried to one of these 5 places, which is just a really big problem for many reasons that I already talked about. So not all hope is lost. I know I said a lot of really bad things that seem to be like really down, but there are ways that we can fix this issue as organizations and individual people. So I think the first and foremost, the most important is to buy less single-use plastic. So for example, I have some up here and I'll just touch on a few. So instead of buying giant packages of plastic bottled water, you can take your own reusable bottles with you. Same thing with grocery bags, which I actually do myself. I just started doing that. I bought my own grocery bags that I take to the grocery store with me. And just stuff like that. You can take your own coffee cup to a coffee shop and they will fill your coffee cup up instead of having to use the single-use reusable, or the single-use ones that they give you at the store. And the second way to fix this problem is efficient recycling. As I talked about earlier, recycling does help, but only if done correctly. And so I think that comes from a personal level and a governmental level. So as people, I think we need to be more educated on what needs to be recycled and what cannot be recycled and how to recycle properly. And also on a governmental level, I think they need to realize that not everyone's gonna adhere to the rules of recycling correctly. And so to make up for it, I think they need to spend more time and money or figure out how to efficiently sort through the trash better in order to make recycling more efficient. And then also big businesses should also adhere to strict recycling laws, because I know that there are a lot of big businesses and even cities that don't recycle well. So my grandparents live in Bernie, Texas, and it's kind of like a little subsect of like near San Antonio, about like 45 minutes out. And since they're so far out in the country, recycling trucks actually don't go to their homes. So there's like thousands and thousands of people in this like little city that don't have access to recycling just based on the city's rules. So I think stuff like that can really be improved. And also, like I stated, education is a big deal. So I think that there needs to be, it's not people's fault that they don't know how to recycle well. Yes, there's the internet, but also there's so many people that do not have access to internet or stuff like that. So I think recycling and efficient recycling needs to be taught in schools, needs to be taught to big businesses and stuff like that, as I stated earlier. And so who is leading the charge? I just put 3 up here, or 3 big businesses that I put up here just to highlight. I looked it up so many times, I have no idea how to pronounce that word, so I'm not even gonna try. But it's basically just a technology company that makes really, really incredible like buoyant technology that sifts through trash in the ocean really, really effectively. 4Ocean is one of my favorite ones. They basically go around the world's oceans and pick up trash and then turn their single-use plastics or any of the plastic that they find into products that they then sell. When you buy one of those products, they promise that for every purchase is 1 pound of trash picked up from the ocean. So it's this really great cycle of recycling and reusing. And then the ocean cleanup, which is basically the same concept as this. They also do a lot of really cool education seminars to teach people about how to recycle efficiently and also to use less single-use plastics. Questions, but we're not doing those, and then here are my references.
Cool. I think it's Ichthyam.
Ichthyam? Okay, I was gonna say Ichthyam, but I just didn't want to try.
Awesome, thank you. So I've learned 2 things quickly before I let you go. One is, again, 10 people in this class is gigantic. So sorry, we have to rush through this a little more quickly than I would have liked. Second thing I've learned is that for the final presentation, we're going to use those 3 weeks. If you look at the schedule, the last one is if necessary, and my guess is if necessary. I don't want to force you through a mad dash, especially given the effort that I've seen so far and the quality of the slides that I've seen so far looks superb, right? That's just my general comment. So for the final presentations, we're going to do 3, 3, and 4. So we will have a more relaxed, you'll certainly get questions from the audience. So thanks, everybody. If you can just leave your stuff on the front here as you exit. And then I will send you an email later. I'm gonna upload the video to my YouTube channel. And in the email, I'll just say, okay, maybe you're in this time slot, you're in that time slot, so you don't, unless you want to just keep watching everybody again and again. All right.
Oh, Dr. Sawyer, how long is that?
12 minutes and 12 seconds.